Have you ever stopped to think that you might be living a life that isn't yours? That every decision you make, every fear you feel, every limit you believe you have was installed in your mind by other people? The uncomfortable truth is that you've been programmed since childhood. Your parents, school, society, they all engraved neural circuits in your brain without asking permission. And the worst part, you continue executing these programs every day, believing they're your authentic choices. But there's a man who discovered something extraordinary. Itzhak Bentov, a scientist obsessed with consciousness, realized that if the mind can be programmed involuntarily, it can also be reprogrammed voluntarily. He developed a technique of brainwashing himself, not to destroy who he was, but to free himself from the invisible chains controlling his life. What you're about to discover here isn't empty motivational theory. It's a real, measurable neurological process that can dissolve decades of conditioning and install a completely new version of who you are. The question is, do you have the courage to erase the code others wrote for you and become the programmer of your own consciousness? Our brain functions like a sophisticated biocomputer, processing millions of pieces of information per second through frequencies and electrical patterns. Itzhak Bentov spent years studying this extraordinary machine we carry inside our skulls, and what he discovered can completely change how you see your own mind. Every experience you've lived since the moment you were born has been recorded in specific neural circuits, as if they were programs being installed on a computer. The childhood trauma you don't even consciously remember anymore is there, running in the background. The beliefs your parents repeated 1,000 times are there, executing automatic commands. The fears that society implanted in you through education, media, social interactions, all of them created electrical pathways in your brain. These circuits don't just sit stored as passive memories. They become automatic, triggering reactions without you needing to consciously authorize them. You meet someone similar to someone who hurt you in the past, and your body tenses up before you even exchange a word. You hear criticism and feel that sensation in your stomach that's been there since childhood. You want to do something different in life, but an internal voice repeats the same objections you've heard for years. These are the programs running. The vast majority of people spend their entire lives obeying these commands without ever questioning where they came from. What we call involuntary brainwashing wasn't a malicious process executed by some external force conspiring against you. It was installed through survival, through trauma, through cultural repetition. Your parents programmed you with their beliefs, who were programmed by their parents, in a chain that crosses generations. School programmed you to obey authorities, not to question too much, to fit into patterns. The media programmed you with ideals of success, beauty, happiness that might not even really be yours. And the most interesting part, you yourself continued this programming, reinforcing the same circuits every time you repeated the same thoughts, every time you reacted the same way, every time you chose the safe path because it was the known one. We're not talking about pretty metaphors. We're describing real, measurable, scientific neurological processes. The synapses in your brain strengthen with repeated use, creating neural highways where electrical impulses travel at high speed. The more you think in a certain way, the easier it becomes to think that way again. The more you react in a certain manner, the more automatic that reaction becomes. Your brain loves efficiency, so it turns everything you do repeatedly into automatism. This was wonderful for learning to walk, to talk, to drive. But it also means your fears, your insecurities, your destructive patterns are operating on autopilot. The revolutionary discovery wasn't just identifying this conditioning process. It was realizing something that changes everything. If the mind can be programmed involuntarily, it can also be reprogrammed voluntarily. The same neurological mechanisms that installed the old patterns can be used to install new patterns. The brain's neuroplasticity, this ability to create new circuits and weaken old ones, remains active throughout your entire life. You're not trapped by the programs you receive. The question is, Are you willing to become the programmer of your own consciousness, or will you continue executing codes that other people wrote for you decades ago? The brain doesn't operate at a single, stable frequency. It constantly oscillates between different states of brain waves, each corresponding to a specific type of consciousness. Beta waves dominate your daily life, that state of constant alertness, processing information, solving problems, interacting with the external world. But there are other states, deeper ones, where something extraordinary happens to the rigid structure of your mental patterns. Itzhak Bentov dedicated years to measuring these frequencies and discovered that altered states of consciousness aren't nebulous mystical experiences. They're measurable and replicable alterations in the brain's electrical activity. Theta waves appear in that moment between being awake and asleep, during deep meditations in trance. Delta waves dominate deep sleep, where the brain does necessary maintenance. What he realized completely changed the understanding of personal transformation. In these slower states, the rigid neural circuits you've built over years become malleable again. Think of the brain as an operating system running thousands of programs simultaneously. During the beta state, awake and active, the programs are all executing, responding to stimuli, keeping you functioning in automatic mode. Trying to change a deep pattern in this state is like trying to rewrite a program's code while it's running at full speed. You can make small adjustments, but deep structural changes are nearly impossible. The system resists because it needs to maintain operational stability. But in theta and delta states, something different happens. The brain slows down, the programs stop executing with such force, and you gain access to what we could call the source code of your consciousness. In this state, neuroplasticity increases drastically. The synaptic connections that seemed permanent reveal their true nature. They're just patterns maintained by repetition and energy. Remove the constant energy feeding them, and they begin to dissolve. Deep meditation isn't superficial relaxation or positive thinking. It's a deprogramming technology. You sit, close your eyes, and begin to slow down the frantic rhythm of thoughts. In the beginning, the mind resists fiercely. It was trained to always be active, always processing, always reacting. But as you persist, maintaining attention on a breath, a mantra, a focal point, the brain waves begin to slow down. Beta gives way to alpha, alpha gives way to theta. And in this theta territory, the walls you built around your beliefs begin to show cracks. Controlled breathing operates on the same principle. Techniques like holotropic breathwork or pranayama aren't just oxygenation exercises. They alter blood chemistry, modify oxygen flow to the brain, and force a state change. You might feel dizzy, tingling, a sensation of expansion. It's not a placebo effect. It's your brain entering a different frequency, where conditioned patterns lose their habitual strength. Sensory deprivation takes this even further. In a float tank, without light, without sound, without apparent gravity, the brain loses the external references that normally keep it in the beta state. Without stimuli to process, it has no choice but to dive into deeper frequencies. There, in absolute silence, you encounter something both disturbing and liberating. You realize that most of your thoughts aren't really yours. They're echoes, recordings playing on loop, programs executing without real necessity. This neuroplastic window that opens in altered states is temporary but powerful. During those minutes or hours in theta, the brain is ready to receive new instructions, to form new connections, to weaken old ones. It's in this space that real deprogramming happens. Not through willpower during the beta state, where you're fighting against programs running at full power, but in the silence between thoughts, where the system is open for modification. The challenge is that you need to access these states intentionally and repeatedly. An occasional deep meditation won't undo decades of conditioning, but a daily practice, diving into these altered frequencies, consistently creating these windows of neuroplasticity, begins to erode the old patterns like water shaping stone. Drop by drop, session after session, the rigid circuits lose strength. and in the vacuum that forms, something needs to begin observing what's happening. Have you ever noticed that you can think about your own thoughts? Can observe your emotions while they're happening? This seemingly simple capacity is one of the most powerful deprogramming tools you possess. Most people live completely identified with every thought that arises in the mind, as if they were the same thing. A thought of fear appears and they become the fear. A limiting belief arises and they believe they are that limitation. But something changes radically the moment you discover you can watch these processes happening without being dragged by them. Itzhak Bentov called this conscious dissociation, and it's not about escaping reality. It's exactly the opposite. It's becoming more aware of what's really happening inside you, creating a space between the observer and the observed. Think of a movie screen. The images projected on it can be dramatic, scary, joyful, or sad, but the screen remains untouched. It doesn't become the movie. You can learn to be that screen, watching the mental films that your programming insists on projecting, without confusing yourself with them. This process begins with something very simple: paying attention. You're in traffic and someone cuts you off. Immediately anger arises, your body tenses, curse words rise up your throat. Up to here, everything's automatic, the program running. But if you can, in that exact moment, take a step back internally and observe. Look, anger is here. The body is tense. Aggressive thoughts are arising. You've just created a crack in the system. Because whoever is observing the anger cannot be the anger. Whoever is noticing the thoughts cannot be just the thoughts. This observation without judgment is crucial. It's not about suppressing the anger or pretending it doesn't exist. It's simply witnessing, with the same neutrality you'd watch clouds crossing the sky. The cloud passes, you don't chase after it, don't try to hold it, don't identify as being that cloud. Thoughts and emotions can function exactly like this if you allow it. Each time you practice this observation, something extraordinary happens at the neural level. The circuits that fire automatically begin to lose strength. These circuits stay active through identification and unconscious repetition. You think the anxious thought, believe it completely, react to it, and the circuit reinforces itself. But the moment you observe the anxious thought as just a passing mental event, you interrupt the reinforcement cycle. It's like stopping feeding a fire. The technique seems too simple to be powerful, and that's exactly why most people underestimate it. In the first days, you'll catch yourself completely identified with thoughts 90% of the time. But every now and then, for a few seconds, you manage to take that step back and just observe. Those seconds are valuable. Over time, the observation intervals increase. You begin to catch the patterns more quickly. That internal critical voice arises and you recognize, it's the self-criticism program running again. The most liberating aspect of this practice is realizing you're none of these patterns. The belief that you're anxious, that you're inadequate, that you're limited, all these identifications begin to reveal themselves as temporary programming. Whoever is observing all these beliefs needs to be something prior to them, something that exists independent of them. The involuntary brainwashing worked because you never questioned being those thoughts. Voluntary brainwashing begins with this act of observation that makes the invisible visible again. And as the patterns weaken, empty spaces begin to form in your mental structure, spaces ready to receive something completely new. The old patterns are weakening. Constant observation has created fissures in the automatic circuit. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so does your mind. The space that opens needs to be filled consciously, otherwise the old programs will return to occupy the territory by sheer force of habit. Here enters a fundamental understanding about how consciousness really works. The mind doesn't completely distinguish between real experience and intensely imagined experience. Itzhak Bentov spoke about the mind as a holographic system. Each mental image you create isn't just a passing thought without consequences. It contains informational energy that projects itself toward physical reality. This isn't superficial positive thinking, those empty affirmations repeated mechanically while your conscious mind laughs at the lie. It's something completely different. It's the deliberate creation of new neural circuits through imagined experience so vivid, so detailed, so charged with emotion, that the brain can't distinguish it from reality. Think about how your body reacts during a dream. You dream you're running and your heart really accelerates. You dream you're falling and wake up with that physical sensation in your stomach. The body responded as if the experience were real, because for the nervous system, the experience was real. The same brain chemistry was released, the same circuits were activated. Deep visualization operates on this same principle, but in an intentional and directed way. Reprogramming begins by precisely choosing what you want to install. Not generic and nebulous versions like, I want to be happy or I want to be successful. It needs to be specific, sensory, tangible. How do you move in the world being this new version of yourself? How do you speak? How do you breathe? What emotions inhabit your body? What decisions do you make naturally? You need to build such a complete image of this new identity that it becomes more real in your mind than the old identity you're dissolving. The process requires a specific state of consciousness. You can't do this in the middle of the day with your mind accelerated in beta, processing thousands of distractions. You need to enter that theta state you learn to access through deep meditation. In this state, with brain waves slowed down, you begin the visualization. Close your eyes and build the scene internally with all possible details. Not just visual images, but sounds, tactile sensations, even smells if you can. The more senses you engage, the more real the experience becomes for the brain. But the essential ingredient, what separates powerful visualization from useless daydreaming, is emotion. You need to feel the experience while you visualize it. Feel the confidence of that new version of you vibrating in your chest. Feel the freedom from dissolved old patterns. Feel the sensation of achievement, of alignment, of personal power. Emotion is what etches the information deeply into neural circuits. It's what signals to the brain. This is important, this needs to be remembered, this needs to be integrated. The daily repetition of this emotionally charged visualization begins to build the new circuit. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Each session strengthens the connections. Your brain begins to treat that visualized new identity as a real possibility, then as a probability, and eventually as the default configuration. You literally become the programmer of your own consciousness, writing new code to replace the code that was installed without your permission. But for this new programming to become permanent, something still needs to die completely. The ego is a brilliant survival mechanism. It built a coherent narrative about who you are, based on all the experiences, traumas, and conditioning you've accumulated. And now you're trying to dissolve this narrative, erase the programs that defined your identity for decades. The ego won't simply allow this without resistance. It will fight because from its point of view, you're threatening its very existence. This resistance manifests as fear, as doubt, as that internal voice that whispers, "Who do you think you are to change like this?" Itzhak Bentov recognized that superficial transformation is easy. You change some habits, adjust some behaviors, and continue being fundamentally the same person with a new coat of paint. But deep transformation, the kind that really breaks with entrenched patterns, requires something more radical. It requires a symbolic death. A moment where you deliberately abandon who you believed you were, allowing that identity to completely disintegrate before building something new. This death isn't comfortable. In fact, it can be terrifying. Because you're letting go of the structures that gave meaning to your life, even if those structures were limiting. You're diving into the unknown without guarantees of what you'll find on the other side. The fear that arises in this moment isn't irrational. It's the survival system screaming that you're doing something dangerous. And in a way, you are. You're killing the old version of yourself. There are several ways to induce this symbolic death. Prolonged fasting is one of them. After days without food, something changes in your consciousness. The body enters a different metabolic state, the brain begins to function with ketones instead of glucose, and that rigid sense of identity begins to soften. You realize you can exist without the habitual certainties. Deep sensory isolation works in a similar way. Days alone, in absolute silence, without external stimuli, and the mental patterns that seemed so solid begin to reveal themselves as fragile constructions. The induced existential crisis is perhaps the most intense form. You deliberately place yourself before the big questions you've spent your life avoiding. Who am I really, stripped of all social roles? What remains if I remove the beliefs I learned? Is there something essential in me, or am I just a collection of programming? These questions, contemplated deeply in a meditative state, can trigger an internal collapse. Everything you used as a reference begins to crumble. The moment of this collapse is the hardest. You feel like you're losing your footing, that you no longer know who you are, that maybe you made a terrible mistake starting this process. Every fiber of your being wants to run back to the safety of the old patterns. But if you resist the impulse to flee, if you remain in this empty space long enough, something extraordinary begins to emerge. You realize you still exist, even without all those identifications. A pure consciousness continues witnessing everything, even after all the layers of conditioning have been peeled away. This is the true rebirth. It's not adding something new on top of the old. It's letting the old die completely, crossing through the void, and then rebuilding from scratch with full awareness. You become the architect of your own psyche, no longer a passive resident in a house others built for you. But the reconstruction needs to be done carefully, because the new structure needs to stand on its own. Reprogramming doesn't end at the moment of revelation. That deep insight, that transformative experience where everything seems to make sense, is just the starting point. The brain still carries the memory of old circuits engraved over decades. If you don't anchor the new patterns concretely, the nervous system will naturally regress to what's familiar. The mind may have understood the change, but the body needs to learn to live this change. Itzhak Bentov realized something many forget. Transformation needs to leave the head and enter the entire organism. Your body holds its own memories in muscles, in posture, in tension and relaxation patterns. The way you breathe, how you move your shoulders, how you position your spine, all of this was shaped by the old version of yourself. Reprogramming only thoughts while the body continues operating in old molds creates an internal split that eventually pulls you back. Specific body practices serve exactly this purpose. Intentional movements that communicate to the nervous system a new way of existing in space. Each conscious gesture, each directed breath, each change in posture is sending electrical signals to the brain that reinforce the new programming. The body learns through physical repetition, just as the mind learns through mental repetition. Ancient disciplines like yoga or Tai Chi aren't just exercises, they're technologies of somatic reprogramming. Mantras carry another layer of this process. Certain combinations of sounds, vocalized repeatedly, produce physical vibrations that resonate with specific brain structures. It's not mystical belief, it's applied physics. The frequencies generated by the vocal cords create mechanical waves that cross the skull and stimulate areas of the brain. Ancient traditions tested these sound combinations until they discovered which ones produced the desired states of consciousness. You can use these tools to tune your brain to the frequency of the new patterns you're installing. But the definitive test of the new programming happens in daily decisions. Each choice you make either reinforces the new circuits or feeds the old ones. Here there's no room for pretty theories or noble intentions. The brain only consolidates patterns through real action in the physical world. You reprogrammed yourself to be more assertive? Then you need to say no to things you'd previously accept out of fear. Installed circuits of confidence? You need to take calculated risks you'd previously avoid. Neuroplasticity responds to concrete experience, not isolated imagination. In the beginning, this requires constant vigilance. The old patterns still have gravitational pull, drawing you toward familiar behaviors. But as you maintain daily practices, move the body in new ways, use sound tools, and especially make decisions aligned with the new identity, something gradual but inevitable happens. The effort decreases. The new way of being stops seeming artificial or forced. The newly formed neural circuits gain density, conduction speed, stability. What previously required conscious intention begins to flow automatically. Your body responds differently to situations. Your voice comes out with different energy. Your choices naturally align with the reprogrammed version. The automatism that previously kept you trapped now works in your favor, executing the new programming you consciously designed and installed through deliberate repetition and physical embodiment. Think honestly. How many of your beliefs are really yours? How many of your fears did you choose to have? How many of your limitations did you consciously build? The answer is probably none. You inherited all of it, but now you know you can change. The technique is in your hands. The altered states of consciousness, neutral observation, visualization charged with emotion, the symbolic death of the old self, the physical anchoring of new patterns. All of this works. The question is, will you use it? Leave in the comments. What's the oldest mental pattern you want to dissolve? What version of yourself do you want to install in its place? And if this content stirred something inside you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.